When grief looks suspicious and truth becomes performance. Let's go ahead and dive into this. At the center of this discussion are Patsy Ramsey, her husband John, and their son Burke, three people who, after JonBenet's death, became unwilling fixtures in one of the most scrutinized cases in modern American history. What we're focusing on here isn't just the facts or timelines, it's behavior, interpretation, and perception, how people react, how those reactions get judged, and how those judgments sometimes replace actual evidence. From the start, the media, the public, and even some investigators latched on to how Patsy carried herself, how she looked, how she spoke, how she grieved, and those surface-level readings quickly became the foundation of the public narrative. And maybe that's the first real problem. When someone is put under a microscope during a crisis, every twitch, pause, and blink becomes a symbol. Not a human response, but a clue. But what if those clues never meant what people thought they did? What if they were simply normal, physiological, and emotional responses to shock, misread as deceitful behavior because they didn't look right? That's the tension we're dealing with here. The space where suspicion feels like proof even when it isn't. There's also the deeper issue of narrative demand. People want stories to make sense, and when no clear external suspect emerges, suspicion turns inward. In this case, it landed squarely on Patsy Ramsey. Her controlled demeanor became a target, her pageant background a weapon, her measured grief a sign of image management. But maybe that wasn't deception. Maybe it was survival. This analysis isn't about guilt or innocence, it's about interpretation, and how psychology, criminology, and media framing turned perception into the storm of speculation that defined this case. 1. The public's perception of Patsy's demeanor as unnatural. And the public and media frequently found Patsy Ramsey composed demeanor unsettling, particularly in the immediate aftermath of her daughter's murder. In the Burke Dr. Phil transcript 1, it is explicitly stated that Patsy had an image problem, a very big one. This source further elaborates that she didn't fit the image of what people thought a grieving innocent mother of a murdered child looks like. Her composure on camera, rather than showing overt sobbing or crying, unnerved people and led to questions like, why isn't she crying? Why isn't she sobbing? This perceived lack of outward emotional display, combined with her family's wealth, education, and Patsy's past as a beauty contest winner, made it easy for people to look at Patsy and go, you probably did this. In the other side of suffering, the father of JonBenet Ramsey tells the story of his journey from grief to grace. John Ramsey recounts how suspicion unfairly focused on them. He describes the world media's tabloid-fueled frenzy that sought their conviction despite their immense personal tragedy. John also recalls a policeman noting Patsy crying through splayed fingers and deeming it suspicious, leading to the conclusion that she was faking her misery. This perception extended to John himself, who was criticized for being either too emotional or too composed. Patsy's attorney, in the Linda Hoffman Pugh's libel suit, acknowledges the impact of her tearful protestations of innocence on national television in contributing to the case's massive media coverage. Moreover, the Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit highlights how media narratives, such as those in the documentary, employed biased and unreliable statement analysis of the Ramseys' public appearances. The documentary, according to the lawsuit, implied that Patsy staged the 911 call and that her tone during the call seemed rehearsed. It also criticized John Ramsey for saying they successfully accomplished their formal interrogation, framing this as a suspicious statement. The document further claims that Patsy's side-to-side head nod during an interview was knowingly and falsely used to imply that Burke killed JonBenet. Public perception of grief often follows a script: tears, disheveled appearance, and visible anguish. Patsy Ramsey didn't fit that script. She appeared composed, articulate, and put together, which clashed with what many expected from a grieving mother. That mismatch alone fueled discomfort and suspicion, even though such expectations are more cultural than scientific. Television and film deepen these expectations by teaching us how real grief should look: When someone doesn't perform their pain in that familiar way, it feels off, and observers tend to assume insincerity. The same cues that might mean composure in one context are interpreted as calculation in another, turning social perception into a false forensic judgment. Layered onto that is social bias, particularly around class and gender. As a former beauty queen, Patsy carried an image of polish and practiced charm. Instead of being seen as poise under pressure, her appearance was read as manipulation. Gender norms made the double standard worse. Mothers are expected to fall apart, while fathers can grieve silently and still be viewed sympathetically. Media framing amplified these perceptions. Neutral footage became suggestive narratives when paired with voiceovers, somber music, and close-ups. This curation encouraged viewers to draw conclusions from edited slices of her behavior rather than full context. Once the suspicion narrative took hold, confirmation bias drove people to interpret every appearance through a lens of guilt. Physiology adds another layer often ignored. Trauma can trigger tonic immobility, a stress response where the body freezes and emotions flatten. Someone in that state may look calm or detached, but is internally overwhelmed. What appears to be control or performance can simply be a neurological shutdown. We also overestimate our ability to predict our reactions to grief, a flaw called affective forecasting. People assume they'd collapse or rage, then project that imagined response onto others. When someone reacts differently, suspicion grows. Under such scrutiny, Patsy faced a no-win scenario. Breaking down might have been called overacting, while composure was labeled coldness. Behavioral interpretations only became harsher with time. Ambiguity in the case left people searching for clues, and every detail, posture, tone, even lipstick was reinterpreted to fit suspicions. This is the fundamental attribution error at work, where behavior is blamed on personality traits rather than external stress and trauma. Forensic psychology concepts like behavioral leakage or emotional congruence were often misused in documentaries to imply guilt. In reality, mismatches between words, tone, and gestures are common under stress and do not reliably signal deception. Still, heavily edited clips repackaged natural stress reactions as incriminating evidence. Another overlooked factor is the pressure of constant surveillance. Being scrutinized by the media and the public can push people into impression management, polishing their speech, adjusting their posture, or rehearsing responses as a way to survive the spotlight. Ironically, those coping mechanisms often backfired, being reinterpreted as proof of cunning or deceit, when in reality, they were signs of a woman trying to hold herself together under impossible circumstances. Over time, that scrutiny created a feedback loop. Each new documentary, headline, or soundbite reinforced the public's suspicions, embedding those biases deeper with every retelling. Patsy's image became frozen in a narrative of guilt, leaving little room for nuance or empathy. The complexity of her trauma, her physiology, and her coping mechanisms were lost beneath a story people had already decided to believe. Taken together, these layers, cultural expectations, media framing, physiological realities, and cognitive biases, created a powerful lens that distorted public perception. Patsy Ramsey's image became less about her actual behavior and more about what people needed or expected to see in her. That perception, once entrenched, has been nearly impossible to undo. 2. Could this be the result of shock and media pressure, or was it evidence of image management in the face of guilt? Patsy Ramsey's demeanor can be understood through two lenses: the profound impact of shock and overwhelming media pressure, and accusations of deliberate image management. A. Shock and media pressure. From the earliest moments, Patsy's state was described as one of intense distress. In the OCR_1996-1226 Police Supplemental Report French, Officer French noted that upon his arrival, Patsy was very upset and distraught, making it difficult to obtain information from her. The OCR_1997-18 Supplemental Report Linda Arndt, JonBenet Ramsey, details her condition further, stating she seemed to have a far-off look in her expression. Her thoughts were scattered, and she would collapse in tears and repeatedly asked why had she not been able to hear her baby. Paramedics also observed her as swooning and obviously very distraught, though not in need of physical medical attention. Her family physician, Dr. Buff, attested that Patsy was in a fragile emotional state and in no condition to leave the house for police interviews. John Ramsey, in his 1998 interview with Smith and Kane, described Patsy as very well. She's been hurt as much as she could be hurt, so there's nothing else that anybody can do to her that would hurt her any more than the loss of JonBenet. He recalled her being hysterical upon discovering the ransom note and during the 911 call. Patsy herself, in her April 1997 interview, expressed that she didn't care what the media says, stating, "I do not give one diddly squat what the media says." The Death of Innocence by John and Patsy Ramsey vividly describes Patsy's immediate reaction to the ransom note. She was in shock and rocking and moaning, a mixing bowl between her knees, as the urge to vomit is close. When JonBenet's death was confirmed, her shrieks were so horrible they surely had to be heard and recorded in heaven and earth's archives of parental anguish. The book emphasizes that for days, Patsy was senseless in shock, nearly comatose, unable to stand up or feed herself, and that a physician prescribed medication for them. The profound nature of their grief is further illustrated by John's description of them going through the 7 stages of grief together, including prolonged periods of shock, the disbelief, the numbness. The Ramsey Updates police report from March 1997 corroborates that police had difficulty obtaining handwriting samples because Patsy is reported to have been taking medication since December 26th. The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit explicitly states that Patsy was heavily medicated during the CNN interview. Mired in grief, Patsy had taken anti-anxiety medication and tranquilizers that altered her speech and demeanor. Her actions, such as crying through splayed fingers, were seen by some police as suspicious, but were later explained as a manifestation of her shock. B. Evidence of image management in the face of guilt, as alleged by accusers. Accusations of guilt and image management were a persistent theme. In the Linda Hoffman Pugh's libel suit, it is alleged that Patsy and killed her daughter JonBenet Ramsey, either accidentally or intentionally, and then prepared a handwritten kidnap ransom note in the hope of making her crime look like the work of a third-party intruder. The lawsuit claims that Patsy, along with the knowing help of her husband, maliciously directed suspicion away from herself. It further alleges that the Ramseys went on national television several times and warned the American public that there is a killer on the loose, while repeatedly denying any involvement in the death of her daughter, despite knowing these statements to be untrue. The sole purpose of these public statements, according to the lawsuit, was to divert attention away from Patsy Ramsey. The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit details how pseudo-experts in the documentary deride John for showing grace rather than vitriol, implying that John was covering for Burke. The documentary also suggests that the length and content of the ransom note were indicative of a sales job or staging by Patsy to cover up the crime. Detective Steve Thomas, in his interview featured in Burke Ramsey versus CBS, stated his belief that she was the author of that ransom note and that the district attorney's reluctance to accept this was preposterous. He claimed that the police believed that Patsy lost her temper with JonBenet in the middle of the night when she wet the bed, leading to an accidental injury that Patsy then staged a crime to cover up. John Ramsey, in his 1998 interview, discusses the frivolous motives floating around that were preventing a serious investigation. He states that their purpose for public interviews was to publicly represent ourselves against this basic avalanche to crucify us. But a view to crucify us I bakes because to crucify us. And vakes, The Death of Innocence also describes the media leaking stories to the media that portrayed us as uncooperative parents, and that they chose to do the CNN interview to protect our family's reputation and refute false police leaks. This indicates a conscious effort to manage their public image amidst intense scrutiny and accusations. Shock isn't just surprise, it's a physiological shutdown where the body flips into survival mode, heart rate spikes, thinking narrows, and emotional processing goes offline. That's why people in crisis often look distant or mechanical, not because they don't care, but because their system is overloaded. Seen through that lens, much of Patsy Ramsey's early behavior makes sense. Accounts of her being unable to function, needing medication to stabilize, and appearing detached align more with neurological overload than guilt. To outsiders unfamiliar with these responses, though, that blankness can look calculated. This ties into emotional flooding, where the brain, overwhelmed by stress, shuts down expressive capacity. Silence, stiffness, or flat expressions aren't strategy, they're a system in overload. Yet public interpretation often flips this, reading the absence of visible emotion as manipulation rather than malfunction. Media attention only magnified this misreading. Under intense scrutiny, people instinctively shift into impression management, rehearsing words, straightening posture, and clinging to routines for a sense of control. What to the person feels like, survival often reads to the audience as deceit, especially when paired with a narrative that's already suspicious. Medications like benzodiazepines added complexity. These drugs can blunt outward emotion, leaving someone looking robotic while feeling devastated internally. Pair that with constant public accusation, and you get a person split between private despair and public composure, a psychological compartmentalization that is more about survival than scheming. Family and social dynamics made this even more complex. Within the Ramsey household, roles naturally formed in the chaos, John retreating into quiet control while Patsy became the public voice. To those inside the storm, this division was instinctive, a way to keep functioning. To those on the outside, it looked like calculation. Without understanding that context, what was a coping strategy was too easily misread as collusion. The relentless coverage only amplified this cycle. Every appearance became another opportunity for interpretation, every word dissected for hidden meaning. That constant pressure heightened the spotlight effect, where Patsy, feeling watched from every angle, worked even harder to manage how she appeared. Ironically, the more she tried to hold herself together, the more unnatural she seemed, feeding the very narrative she was trying to survive. Yet suspicion, once anchored, rarely lets go. Cognitive framing and confirmation bias ensure every gesture, outfit, or tone reinforces the belief already in place. It's easier to construct a neat internal story of guilt than to sit with ambiguity, and blaming the parents provided a sense of closure that a messy, unresolved investigation couldn't. The danger in this dynamic is that behavior replaces evidence in the public mind. Forensic ethics demand proof, but when intuition takes over, everything becomes a signal. The posture, the note, the interviews. That confirmation creep narrows focus, burying the real investigation under layers of performative analysis and media noise. And that's the sobering truth. Once suspicion hardens into narrative, it becomes self-sustaining. The search for truth gets tangled in projection and bias, and the real perpetrator, whether inside or outside the home, disappears into the noise. What's left is a story the public feels certain about, but that the evidence never truly resolved. 3. Does forensic psychology support that grief expression differences can influence suspicion unfairly? Forensic psychology, as reflected in the sources, suggests that differences in grief expression can indeed unfairly influence suspicion. Detective Steve Thomas, in Patsy's April 1997 interview, acknowledges this complexity when discussing the unusual behavior of their friends. And certainly hard to gauge somebody after an event such as this as to whether the behavior is natural or unnatural. Certainly I'm no psychiatrist, but was there ever any what we call pre-offense behavior? This statement, while hinting at an investigative angle, also implicitly recognizes the challenge of interpreting grief. John Ramsey directly addresses this societal expectation in The Other Side of Suffering. The father of JonBenet Ramsey tells the story of his journey from grief to grace. Was there a manual of rules for parents on how to act when a child is missing or murdered? The entire police case against us was based on their sole conclusion that we didn't act right. He criticizes this as a questionable assessment, given the Boulder police's lack of experience with such crimes. He also recounts that Patsy's firm stance against an aggressive investigator was later publicly reported by the police, with the conclusion that Patsy was someone who was capable of inner rage and therefore murder. This illustrates how normal reactions under pressure could be misconstrued and weaponized. The Burke Ramsey versus CBS lawsuit points out the inherent bias in the forensic linguistic analysis and statement analysis used in the documentary, asserting that such analyses were neither applied in a scientifically valid fashion nor had any basis for concluding these statements, or lack thereof, are extremely unusual. It contends that the documentary knowingly and falsely used Patsy's head nod to imply that Burke killed JonBenet, despite knowing that her body language was firmly in line with normal human behavior for someone experiencing dismay and inconsolable grief. The lawsuit also highlights the consciously false and defamatory implication that Burke would have had a more emotional response if he had not killed his sister, twisting his quiet demeanor into a sign of guilt. Burke Ramsey, in his interview on Dr. Phil, reflects on leaked observations from his initial interviews as a child, that it was unusual that you felt safe, that you showed little warmth towards the family, that you displayed an enormous lack of emotion and almost an indifference. He clarifies that his emotional response was simply not public. I was very emotional at the Fernies, and I would just randomly cry out of nowhere. This first-hand account underscores how internal grief can be misinterpreted when not publicly displayed in expected ways. Ultimately, while the police chief in Ramsey updates acknowledged the emotional toll on officers and the community, stating, "Many of us are parents who have felt this loss very deeply. We are doing our own debriefings to deal with our grief, just as community members are participating in debriefings to help themselves cope." The narrative from the Ramseys' perspective consistently points to their perceived abnormal grief expression as a primary driver of suspicion. The eventual exoneration of the Ramsey family by DNA evidence in 2008, as detailed in Burke Ramsey versus CBS and The Other Side of Suffering, the father of JonBenet Ramsey tells the story of his journey from grief to grace, suggests that reliance on behavioral interpretation, rather than concrete evidence, may have led to unfair suspicion. As The Other Side of Suffering states, the suspicions about the Ramseys in this case created an ongoing living hell for the Ramsey family, a hell arguably fueled by the public and police's misinterpretation of their grieving process. Forensic psychology doesn't just examine what people do under stress, it asks why they do it, considering emotional regulation, cognitive load, personality, and context. Public perception often skips this complexity, reducing behavior to surface judgments and allowing vibes to overshadow evidence. One of the strongest biases is the expectation that authentic grief must be loud or dramatic. In reality, grief has no universal template. Some collapse, others go silent, and some function almost mechanically. In the Ramsey case, Patsy's composure wasn't neutral to observers. It was treated as a sign of guilt, even though it revealed nothing definitive about her inner state. This is where grief policing takes hold. When someone's expression doesn't match the cultural script, judgment fills the gap, and demeanor becomes a proxy for guilt. Compounding this problem are pseudoscientific tools like body language reading and statement analysis, often presented as hard science, despite being largely interpretive. A downward glance or flat tone can mean anything, from stress to medication to nothing at all, yet documentaries and interviews package these cues as guilt indicators, giving subjective opinions a false authority that sways public perception and even investigative focus. Neuroscience shows why these assumptions often fail. In crisis, the amygdala surges while the prefrontal cortex misfires, causing people to default to social scripts, smiling, saying "I'm fine," or appearing calm, not out of deceit, but as a survival mechanism. Add cultural context to this mix, and what reads as composure in one community may look cold in another, introducing bias that turns natural differences into red flags. This gap between what forensic science understands and what the public thinks it knows is dangerous. Popular culture flattens nuance into rigid tropes. Crying equals innocence, stoicism equals guilt, and those distortions obstruct justice. And so the deeper question emerges: how much of our suspicion is about pursuing truth, and how much is about soothing our discomfort with uncertainty? When behavior becomes the stand-in for evidence, anyone who doesn't feel right risks being condemned in the court of public opinion, whether the facts support it or not. Public perception of Patsy Ramsey was shaped early and powerfully by the belief that composure equals guilt. She didn't cry on cue, didn't appear disheveled, and spoke clearly, and to many, that looked like control, even manipulation. But the body under extreme stress often defaults to freezing or shutting down. What looks like indifference from the outside can actually be the physiology of survival, where the nervous system numbs itself just to function. Once that first impression was set, media narratives reinforced it. Every appearance and interview was filtered through the lens of suspicion, a process known as narrative anchoring. From that point forward, Patsy wasn't just a mother in crisis. She was a possible suspect, and everything she did was scrutinized for signs of guilt. That scrutiny created a double bind. Too composed looked cold, too emotional looked staged. There was no way for her to perform grief in a way that satisfied public opinion. Physiology, medication, and bias all played roles that few acknowledged. Trauma triggers responses like tonic immobility, where the body freezes to protect itself. Add in anti-anxiety medications known to flatten outward emotion, and you get exactly what viewers saw: a woman appearing calm, even robotic, while internally overwhelmed. Patsy's wealth, polish, and pageant background further clashed with public expectations of what a real grieving mother should look like, and the media amplified those judgments until suspicion became the default narrative. All of this created a dangerous gap between perception and proof. The case against her was built more on feelings than on facts, while the real perpetrator, whoever that was, benefited from the noise. When attention locked on demeanor and personality, physical evidence and investigative logic were buried under layers of emotional interpretation. And that's the sobering reality. When we judge sincerity based on how closely someone's behavior matches our imagined reaction, we stop pursuing truth and start pursuing a story. In that space, cases stop being about evidence and start being about narratives, and that's where everything begins to break down. The story built around Patsy Ramsey said more about the public than it ever did about her. People didn't just observe her, they projected their own expectations onto her, and once those projections hardened into narrative, there was no room left for nuance or ambiguity. What they saw wasn't a mother in shock, it was the version of her they had already decided she should be. When behavior is filtered through suspicion, every gesture becomes a signal, even when it means nothing. Investigators and the public alike began treating those signals as proof, turning an investigation into theater and leaving the facts behind. Stress responses like freezing, masking, or rehearsing composure in public aren't guilt, they're human survival mechanisms. But in the court of public opinion, humanity got mistaken for deception. What this case ultimately reveals is how easily perception can overtake truth. Patsy's tone, posture, and composure were judged through a lens that had already decided what it wanted to see, and reality was distorted to match. The real question was never whether she acted guilty, but why we believe we can tell. When we stop seeking evidence and start chasing validation for our own discomfort, justice isn't served, it's lost. And we can pause there, but I'll say, thanks for watching, hope you are doing well. Don't forget to like, share, and subscribe. And until the next time, take it easy.